After spending the first 5 parts of this chapter talking about everything that happens up to and including childhood, we're now going to move on to part 6 and start talking about adolescence and adulthood. So basically what happens after childhood. So let's start by talking about adolescence. So adolescence is a period of development and gradual transition from childhood to adulthood. In some cultures, you're going to see rites of passage, ceremonies, or events that mark that transition from being a child to being an adult. And though most cultures will have some sort of transitional period between childhood and adulthood, not all are going to show something equivalent to adolescence, where adolescence is a more drawn out and prolonged period of transition. So in a lot of cultures and in different time periods, you would see a much faster transition into adulthood where there was less of this in-between adolescent state. So, for example, it used to be that as soon as they were capable of bearing children, girls were expected to marry. But throughout time, and again with different cultures, this has started to change. So what we commonly think of as adolescence, maybe your teenage years, actually really came into being as part of Western culture, and specifically Western culture in the 18th through to the 20th centuries. Basically, as the Industrial Revolution was happening, new technologies were requiring more highly educated people, which meant more schooling. And more time in school meant that people weren't necessarily children, but they weren't quite ready to be adults and out in the workforce yet. And so adolescence became a much longer period and a much more transitional period. So that's kind of the history on adolescence. But when we're going to talk about adolescence, I want to make it clear that there's a little bit of overlap between adolescence and puberty, but they're not quite the same. Puberty is more of a biological period, and it's going to be a time when people are physically maturing and achieving sexual maturity. Adolescence, on the other hand, is going to include puberty, but it isn't just puberty. Adolescence also includes changes in how we think, the things that we're interested in, our social circumstances, and the expectations that we experience from our parents and society. Let's start by talking about these physical changes. Let's talk about puberty itself. So puberty is ushering in important bodily changes. So your hypothalamus is going to signal your pituitary gland to start secreting hormones, and specifically a lot of hormones that are going to be related to the development of different sex characteristics later on down the line. And so this process is going to trigger rapid maturation, and the whole point of that maturation is sort of changing into someone who is capable of reproduction, so achieving sexual maturation. So we're going to start seeing things like primary and secondary sex characteristics. So our primary sex characteristics are things like our sex organs. Secondary sex characteristics are non-reproductive physical features that are related to the hormones that are being released, but aren't directly related to sex. So things like breasts or facial hair, those are secondary sex characteristics. And some of the landmarks that we start encountering as adolescents enter into puberty are things like menarche, which is the fancy word that I had never heard of before this class, for the first period that females have. You also see for males the production of sperm and their first ejaculation. And so in North America and Europe, more of the Western cultures, you tend to see this occurring between the ages of 11 and 13 for females and 12 and 14 for males. But there's lots of variation across different cultures and different countries and different situations. But that's just sort of the average. Now, the same hormones that are involved in all of those physical changes, developing those sex characteristics, can also have a dramatic effect on brain function. things that are going to be influencing your mood and your behavior. And there's also a lot of psychological stuff going on behind the scenes other than just the sort of biological effects that we're seeing. So a lot of these psychological or these physical changes are going to have psychological consequences. And we also see an interesting difference between the sexes where early maturation tends to influence males and females differently. And the overall trend is that those who go through puberty earlier, if they are male, they tend to experience more positive side effects of that early maturation. And if they're female, they're going to experience a little bit more of the negative side effects. So let's break that down a bit. So with males, early maturation or starting puberty early, it is going to increase their risk of delinquent behavior and drug use. So those are some downsides. But there are also some benefits or positives associated with it, where that maturation is also going to give them increased size and physical strength that can give them a more positive body image. Can also lead to them being more popular and doing well in sports and all of those things that come with it. So even though there are some potential risks associated with going through puberty earlier for males, it tends to be outweighed with the positives, where they come out of it with a positive body image and they tend to feel better about it. In contrast, for females, early maturation is going to lead to negative body image in a lot of cases because that act of maturation leads to weight gain and physical changes. So they start feeling less comfortable in their own skin. And so you can have greater social and sexual pressures because everybody else can see that you're changing and maybe you're not psychologically capable of dealing with that at the time. And so all of these factors can lead those early developing females to feel self-conscious, which can lead to eating disorders and problems in school and depression and anxiety. So in terms of females, early maturation tends to have a lot more negatives associated with it than positives. And again, this can all change depending on your culture and your own personal views, how you perceive that maturation and whether you think it's early or late or what you're expecting or what other people are expecting. So there's lots of social factors going on there as well. Next, we're going to talk about our adolescent brain and how our brain is developing. So we had mentioned earlier on that when you're in infancy and early childhood, your brain is growing very, very quickly. And this rapid growth is going to slow as you enter into adolescence. But there's still going to be development and changing. And so people who have looked at adolescent brains using fMRI have found that their brains are distinct and different in how they're functioning from both children and adults. So adolescents aren't quite children in their brains and they're not quite adults. They are in that transitional state where their brains are distinct. We start seeing sort of a rapid increase in the cortical white matter, especially in their frontal cortex. So these are areas that are important for impulse control and more abstract thinking. So when they start into adolescence, their ability to control their impulses and think in abstract ways isn't quite complete. It isn't quite mature. So that's going to happen throughout adolescence. We're also going to see that the gray matter in that frontal cortex peaks a little bit earlier. So though the white matter is going to be growing and changing over time, the gray matter tends to peak around 11 years old for females or 12 years old for males. So a little bit earlier on. So less change in the gray matter there. And a lot of the changes that we start seeing in the brain aren't necessarily just growth. We also start seeing a lot of pruning of unnecessary cells. So as you mature and experience the world, you're going to start having your brain mapped out just a little bit more effectively. So it's called neural reconstruction, where you're going to especially in your prefrontal cortex and limbic system, start having more efficient pathways that are going to help you with planning and coordinating behaviors and controlling urges and controlling your behavior. And this more efficient process allows you to have more efficient communication between different regions in your brain, so you can process information better, more efficiently, and more quickly. We're also going to see in this period growth in your corpus callosum, which, if you don't remember, is the bridge between the two hemispheres. So the area that allows the movement of information from the right half of your brain to the left and vice versa. And in a 2-year period during adolescence, you actually see an increase of about 10% of the corpus callosum's volume, which is massive. And a lot of it's associated with increased white matter and thought to be involved in increased impulse control, which kind of makes sense. As you move through adolescence, you get better at controlling your behavior and not falling prey to your impulses. Sticking with the physical side of things, we're going to talk about how we change from adolescence into young adults, and not just in terms of physical brain properties, but physical everything. So young adults are going to be at the peak of their physical, sexual, and perceptual functioning. So that is their optimal age. You achieve maximum muscle strength when you're a young adult, specifically around the age of 25 to 30, where you see a lot of muscle strength in the arms, legs, and other parts of the body. We also see peaks in terms of perception because our vision, hearing, reaction time, and all sorts of other things are all going to peak in the mid-20s. So when you're in your mid-20s, your body is functioning optimally. It's going to be sort of the best that it can be during that period. And we do start seeing declines in all of those different areas at different ages. So things like visual acuity, your ability to see precisely, is going to start declining with age. Even your physical status, it's going to start declining as you get older. So your muscles are going to be more stiff and weaker. And this is one of those cases where you can kind of hold off some of this decline if you stay active. So if you're maintaining an active lifestyle, this decline is going to be a lot less impactful on your physical appearance and prowess. But over time, as you get older, your body basically gets worse at maintaining all of those features, things like your muscles and your ability to recover after doing some physical activity. We start seeing larger overall changes to our basal metabolic rate, which, if you remember from 104, our basal metabolic rate is the rate at which our resting body is going to be converting food to energy. So it's kind of like how you're maintaining homeostasis, how your body is idling. And once you hit about the age of 40, that rate is going to slow, meaning that you're going to be burning less energy and you're going to be storing more of that energy, usually in the form of fat. So as you get older, it gets harder to maintain a slim figure because your body is slowing down and storing more fat away. And this ties in with a reduced efficiency of oxygen consumption. So you are less able to make use of the oxygen in the environment. It's going to also compound the lowered basal metabolic rate because reduced oxygen efficiency is going to make it harder to exercise and harder to stay in shape. So everything starts working against you as you get older. And we start seeing that things like your bones may start becoming more brittle. You're slow to heal, both in bones and muscles, as you get older. Now, despite all of this negativity, it's not only decline. We do see that a lot of middle-aged adults can stay in excellent health, especially those who are active. So if you maintain that physical active lifestyle, that rate of decline slows dramatically. And so a lot of the trends where we see that the average adult is declining after a certain age, that's really driven a lot by people who live very sedentary lives. So, staying active is the best way to help prevent that decline or make it less dramatic when it does start happening. Now, if we hop back to the brain, we're going to be looking at the adult brain. So, as we move from adolescence into adulthood, we still see more of these declines, and we're going to see a decline in brain tissue. But this happens quite a bit later on. We're not looking at a dramatic decline starting at age 25 or something like that. We're seeing it much higher ages, so into the 70s, 80s, or 90s, where you start losing up to 5 or even 10% of your brain weight each year. But again, a lot of these changes are affected by your lifestyle, your nutrition, and your attitude. So we do see dramatic declines, and especially dramatic declines in our frontal and parietal lobes, but that can again be mediated by your lifestyle. And we can hop to this next slide here where we can look at MRIs showing that decline. And so looking at these, the areas in red are showing the areas that had the greatest decline across a 4-year period. And they were looking at both men and women between the ages of 59 to 85. So in that older spectrum. And so across this time, they were losing a lot of their brain matter in that prefrontal cortex and in the parietal lobes as well. So sort of the front and off to the sides here. From the physical to the physical brain development, let's switch over to cognitive development. And we're going to, again, go back a little bit to adolescence and talk about adolescent cognitive development. So adolescents are going to display something called adolescent egocentrism, which is basically the idea that adolescents are going to display this self-absorbed and distorted view of their own uniqueness and importance. And this is going to consist of 2 parts. An overestimation of the uniqueness of their feelings and experiences, also called a personal fable, where they can believe that nobody has ever felt something as strongly as I am now. And the second part of this is an oversensitivity to social evaluation. So the idea that everybody is going to know what's going on. They're going to feel constantly watched and judged as though they have a constant imaginary audience. Those who think more egocentrically are going to be a little bit more likely to engage in their risky type behaviors, maybe because they feel invulnerable, but again, not quite sure what the correlation is there, or what's driving that correlation there, I suppose. But despite this issue of the egocentrism that they're experiencing, as adolescents start developing cognitively, they start having a better grasp on hypothetical concepts. They can start having thoughts about things like scientific problems. They start thinking about things like social justice or something as abstract as the meaning of life. So these abstract reasoning abilities are developing. They're going to start showing more flexible and creative thinking. And so if we think back to chapter 9, when we were talking about thinking and thought and learning, they're going to be moving past that stage of deductive reasoning that children were using earlier on. We're going to enter into this idea of formal operational thought. So Piaget's formal operational stage, that's where we're hitting here for most adolescents. So they start using deductive reasoning to solve scientific problems in a systematic fashion. So they're going to be thinking logically and systematically in both concrete and abstract problems. They can start forming hypotheses and they can test things in logical and systematic ways. They're starting to think more adultly, I guess. And we can look at an example of this, which is a standard problem that shows the ability of adolescents to start thinking logically and systematically. So we have this pendulum problem. And you can do this with children of all ages, but we start seeing a more systematic solution as they get into adolescence and closer to adulthood. But the basic idea is you have a pendulum, so a string that is attached to an anchor above. And at the end of the string, you can put a weight. And you would be asked, what variables affect the rate at which the pendulum swings? So how quickly does it oscillate? What factors are affecting this? And so students have the string, and they can change the length of the string. They can change how much weight they put on that string. They can even have a variable release point. So if they release it higher up or lower down, if they push, so throw the weight instead of just allowing it to fall, what factors are going to influence how quickly that pendulum swings? And when children are faced with this problem, they're usually going to start varying things in a non-systematic way. So if they're in that concrete operational stage, the stage before our formal operational stage, we're going to see children changing multiple variables at once. So they're not going to follow a scientific, systematic approach. But adolescents start to learn that they should adjust one thing at a time. They can systematically evaluate this situation. They can form a hypothesis or a set of hypotheses. So if changing the length of the string is going to affect oscillation, then a shorter string will have a different oscillation rate than a longer string. And for those of you who are curious, because I definitely was, the only factor that actually affects the rate at which the pendulum swings is the string length. The weight, the release point, all of those things don't really affect it. The only effect is the length of the string. And so adolescents, having that formal operational stage of thinking, are going to be able to determine that using a systematic approach. Now, if you remember back to chapter 9, you might remember that Piaget thought that the formal operational stage of thinking was the fourth and final stage of cognitive development. They basically thought that adults aren't going to be developing new modes of thinking. They're just going to be using these formal operations in new and more creative ways. However, recent theorists are starting to argue that there is a fifth stage, and they're calling it the post-formal operational thinking. So basically the stage that comes after formal operational thought. And they're saying that people can start logically reasoning about things like opposing points of view. They can accept contradictions in their logic and contradictions in the things that they're experiencing. They're going to start seeing both sides of an argument and might be able to agree that both sides of an argument have valid points. So this is going to be sort of new and more complex ways of reasoning logically, and it's going to allow them to accept that there can be contradictions and irreconcilable differences. You accept that you can't know everything, and the things that you know might contradict with one another. And this is what some people start moving towards as they enter into adulthood. Now, again, as we start talking about adulthood, we're going to start talking about declines in performance. Because like we said, most aspects of our lives tend to peak in our early adulthood. But as we get older, we're going to start seeing gradual declines, especially where we're going to start talking about information processing abilities. Though we're going to talk about a couple of different types of information processing abilities, and we're going to start to realize that the age at which this decline starts and the rate of decline can differ pretty dramatically depending on what you're looking at and even how you're looking at. So we could talk about perceptual speed. So this is our reaction time. So how quickly we can recognize something. And this one starts declining fairly early. And some studies are showing a decline as early as in your 20s. So it starts taking longer to visually identify and evaluate different kinds of stimuli. It gets harder to start recalling context. So we start taking longer to process information. Though some studies are showing that this might not be a direct detriment, it might actually be a trade off. Where as we get older, our speed of processing starts declining, but our accuracy increases. So we take longer to evaluate things, but we're more accurate when doing it. So it's kind of a trade off where it might not be just a net loss. When we talk about our memory for new information, it starts becoming difficult to recall new information that we're given starting in our 30s, though again, there's some differing studies and evidence for this. We see a more steady and consistent decline once we hit our 50s, though again, depending on how you're looking at this ability, we start seeing that there are benefits if we have something like context. So even when you're older, you're going to find it easier to remember meaningful things. So things like sentences that are logical and meaningful, as opposed to lists of unrelated words. So as we get older, we can rely on context to make up for some of the potential detriments that we start experiencing. Moving on to spatial memory, our spatial memory seems to remain pretty much constant throughout most of our adult life, and it starts declining towards our 60s. So this one takes a little bit longer to start declining. Recall is a difficult one, and there's not a whole lot of agreement on how it declines. Recall is going to decline a little bit more quickly than something like recognition, because to accurately recall something, that's what I'm trying to say, to recall something is going to take a lot more resources because you have to actually put it into context and figure out what it is you're seeing. But something like recognition is going to be a little bit easier because you just have to know if it's familiar or not. And then if we want to get really confusing in terms of results, we can start talking about things like prospective memory. And this is our ability to remember to do something in the future. And this one has results all over the place. Sometimes we see equivalent scores between older adults and younger adults in out-of-lab tasks. So when they're out in the real world, where they're going to be able to perform just as well when they're older as they would have when they were younger. Some lab tasks show that younger adults are better at remembering long-term to do something. It's very muddy and murky, and it seems to depend on how this prospective memory is tested. But overall, it kind of seems like the older individuals start to struggle, especially if they're distracted by another task. But some general decline in prospective memory, and the jury is out on the mechanisms of that. We can move next back into intelligence, which, again, we've talked about in earlier chapters, and we kind of already hinted briefly at the idea that the type of intelligence that we rely on is going to change as we age. So originally, people assumed that our IQ score would begin to drop between the age of 30 and 40 and show sort of a steady decline as we got older. But if you separate out different types of intellectual abilities, as opposed to looking at just a general IQ score, you start realizing that this decline isn't necessarily constant or consistent between different types of intelligence. So we can talk about our crystallized intelligence, which is going to be mostly our accumulated verbal skills and our factual knowledge and things like that. That tends to peak in our middle adulthood and then start to gradually decline. In contrast, our fluid intelligence, that ability to perform more mental operations, things like abstract and logical reasoning, do spatial problems, stuff like that, that's going to begin to decline in early adulthood. So it starts declining earlier on. Though I can jump ahead a little bit and talk about the fact that, sort of like what we see with our physical prowess, maintaining physical fitness, helping you maintain your sort of physical abilities as you get older, with intelligence and sort of mental capacity, you start seeing that with intellectual fitness, the more you use your brain, the more you're going to maintain your mental abilities. So studies that had older adults playing video games that helped them cognitively reason were able to show lower rates of decline. So the more you're using those parts of the brain, the more your functioning is preserved. So you kind of run into this use it or lose it state of mind yet again. When researchers first tried to address this question of crystallized versus fluid intelligence and how they change with age, they started with a cross-sectional design. So we end up with some cross-sectional data here that shows that our crystallized intelligence is going to sort of peak in the middle and maintain for quite a while. Here, crystallized intelligence is being measured by verbal ability. But our fluid intelligence, measured by inductive reasoning and spatial orientation performance, these red and green lines show a pretty dramatic decline from the age of 25 through till 81. Now, right off the bat, we could say that, we start using crystallized intelligence more as we get older, and we start using fluid intelligence less as we get older, and we kind of maintain our crystallized intelligence, but we see a gradual decline in fluid intelligence, and that's that. But from what we learned at the beginning of this chapter, there are some things to consider with these cross-sectional designs. So maybe there's something else going on here. Maybe it's because older adults had less exposure to scientific problem solving while they were in school or in work and had less of this fluid intelligence to begin with. So maybe it's not so much a product of age, but it's a product of when these people grew up. So to test if it was actually something to do with aging, or if it's actually something to do with which cohort you grew up in, they then conducted a longitudinal study looking at the same three characteristics, where blue, our verbal ability, is our crystallized intelligence. And then the red and green, our inductive reasoning and spatial orientation, are shown here for fluid intelligence. And instead of this dramatic decline in fluid intelligence, we actually see that all three lines, both types of intelligence, are pretty much consistent during adulthood. We don't see a dramatic drop-off. They tend to sit pretty consistently, though we do end up seeing that this blue line stays higher for longer. So we're seeing a little bit of a reduced drop-off in our crystallized abilities. So our crystallized intelligence maybe doesn't decline as rapidly with age as our fluid intelligence does. So this is one of those critical thinking cases where you have to not just look at one study, because there are some limits to this. We look at the longitudinal data and get a more clear picture. And on the thought of thinking critically, we should also keep in mind what else could be going on here that's driving this. Maybe this reduced performance isn't just measuring intelligence, maybe it's also measuring a little bit of slower processing speed, or poor vision, or reduced hearing capacity, because all of those things can actually affect how people perform on tests, depending on how that test has been given. So, as always, think a little bit critically with these results. So, a big take home here, I guess, is that we do see a decline in cognitive function as we get older, but there are ways to try and mediate some of that decline. So, if you remain physically and intellectually active, it can help with your cognitive function as you age. The textbook makes an interesting detour here to talk about the fact that as you get older, you also have increased wisdom, but again, that's with cross sectional studies. So um, there could be more going on there. We're going to take kind of a big step sideways and we're going to stop talking about intelligence and cognition and things like that. And we're going to start talking about identity, which is eventually going to tie into sort of our social, emotional, and personality development. But let's start with identity. So, moving on from what Erickson had described in his pivotal crises, a new researcher named James Marcia had decided to focus on adolescents' search for identity. And they decided that individuals fit into one of four categories as they were looking for identity. So, you had individuals who fit under the category of identity diffusion, where they hadn't really had a crisis of identity. They weren't concerned about who am I and what do I believe in, and they were pretty much uncommitted to any particular role. So they didn't have any solid values, and they might even be cynical about people having a crisis of identity because it doesn't really matter. Our next group are people who are experiencing foreclosure. And this is when you start adopting a role without actually going through an identity crisis. Basically, you automatically adopt the values of another group, maybe your peers or your parents, and you conform to what is expected of you. You fill the role that you assume you should fill. Next, we move on to the ones that are actually starting to obtain their own identity. So individuals going through a moratorium are in the midst of an identity crisis, and they haven't resolved that crisis yet. They're trying to establish their own identity, and they're sort of working through all of the crisis that comes with that. And then finally, we end up with people who have identity achievement. So they've gone through that identity crisis where they don't know what role they fill, and they finally resolve it. They successfully emerge with a clear set of values and a clear idea of who they are as an individual. And actually, as I went too far back, I think there we go. Now we're back to where I meant to be. So over time, this moratorium and identity achievement group tends to get larger. So as people get older, they start establishing their own identity. And on the other hand, these two, identity diffusion and foreclosure, are fairly high earlier on in life and will gradually decline with age. And it's a good idea to keep in mind that identity is a really complex issue. And there's lots of different moving components going on here. And this can include your gender, your ethnicity, what social group you belong to. It's also going to be made up of our individual characteristics and how you view yourself. And it's all wrapped up within our goals and values. So identity is a really big topic, and you can spend entire courses talking about identity and developing an identity. So we're keeping it fairly brief here. And to make everything more complicated, our individual identities can also change as we age, as we start encountering situations that require us to reevaluate the things we've settled on. So maybe your goals in life start changing as you get older, and because of that, your identity has to change as well. So a really cool concept. The next part we want to start talking about are our sort of interpersonal relations, and specifically looking at our relationships with parents. And so despite what most people might think, where teenagers are always rebelling against their parents and they have a negative view of their parents, most studies find that teens think fairly positively of their parents. 80% of American teens surveyed said that they had a positive view of their parents, and two-thirds of them reported actually having positive relationships. So it's not so much this idea of storm and stress where there's constant conflict and fighting between the parents and their teens. And that dramatic conflict seems to actually be the exception rather than the rule. Though, of course, there's always a little bit more to it than that. Um, there's changing degrees of agreement with parents where sort of people can have an overall positive view of their parents, but they might disagree on certain concepts or topics. And we tend to run into issues where teens tend to lie to their parents at various portions throughout their lives. Which we can actually hop to the next slide here, where we talk about some of the common issues that teens reported having lied to their parents about. So this is just saying what these issues are and how many of the high school students who had been surveyed said that they had lied to their parents about these issues. And these are going to be North American teens, so they lie a lot about their friends, alcohol and drug use, going to parties, money, dating, and sex. But not all teens are lying to their parents about these issues. Despite this tendency for at least some teens to lie to their parents at some point, we do actually see that most teens will confide in their parents when they're faced with a serious problem. So there tends to be at least some relationship there that they can rely on, and they can trust their parents to confide in. So overall, we tend to see that conflict tends to be low, but not non-existent. Now, in cases where there is conflict, so in people going through that storm and stress where the teens and the parents don't get along and disagree and fight, we start seeing a lot of signs of distress. Things like misconduct, where students start acting out. You'll even see antisocial behavior, where they start withdrawing and stop interacting with others. Things like hopelessness and low self-esteem can also come out of a poor relationship with their parents. So it's fairly important that these conflicts get resolved at some point. Now, keeping on with this section's theme of hopping very, very quickly between topics that you could spend days studying, we're actually going to move on again and start talking about this transition to adulthood. So getting from sort of those teenage years and into adulthood proper, especially in terms of the social, emotional, and personality development. So what are people going through as they transition into adulthood? Now, as you're becoming an adult, you start to learn how to protect and care for and provide for a family of your own, mostly by watching other people who have families. So you can interact with and observe others to figure out how you could do that yourself. And one of our sort of major points that tends to signify adulthood is marriage, though we will talk about some alternatives to just marriage. But marriage is typically going to be a key indicator of adulthood in a lot of cultures. Becoming married means that you're starting to show some individualism, you start becoming a responsible and independent person, and then you enter into this close relationship with another individual. And so this process starts becoming very closely intertwined with Erikson. Yet again, we'll bring Erikson back. And Erikson's stages as you start entering into adulthood. So these are more crises that you face, and we're starting to look at the ones that signify entering into adulthood. So we start with the crisis of intimacy versus isolation, which most people encounter in early adulthood. So if you successfully overcome this crisis, you start opening up to others, form close relationships with other people. For example, you would find a spouse, someone that you would want to spend time with. But this intimacy versus isolation could also be resolved with finding close friendships. It doesn't have to be marriage, it just tends to be marriage in a lot of cases that end up studied. Our next stage is this crisis of generativity versus stagnation that people encounter in middle adulthood. And so in this case, generativity is usually when you start trying to do things for other people. You're trying to make the world a better place. You're putting your mark on the world. And this starts to become more and more important to people as they get later into adulthood. So though you do sometimes see these priorities in younger adults, it becomes a really big deal into later adulthood. And then at the end, we face the crisis of integrity versus despair. And this is your final crisis, where basically you sit down and evaluate your life and see how you feel about how you lived, especially as you start facing the end of your life. So, how are you going to approach death? So, people will review their lives, evaluate the meaning and what they got out of it, and if they successfully overcome this crisis, if they start to feel integrity, they may come out with a feeling of completeness and fulfillment because they feel that they led a good life and they're happy with what they managed to do. In contrast, some people might not feel fulfilled. They might end up feeling regretful and they might despair at the end of their lives because they didn't accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. So it can go either way with this. We're going to swing back and talk more about approaching death towards the end of the chapter. So we have something to look forward to. But let's go back to talking about marriage and family. And I had mentioned that it isn't always going to be marriage as that leaping off point into adulthood. We also see things like cohabitation, where couples live in committed relationships and live together without actually marrying each other. And some couples will use this as like a trial run before they get married. So they'll cohabitate before getting married. Sometimes people will choose to cohabitate without wanting to get married. And this trend of cohabitation seems to be becoming more common in younger couples. And over time, more and more people are choosing to cohabitate rather than just get married. So it's an interesting shift in culture right now. And whether you cohabitate or marry, both cases lead to forming a family of sorts. And we run into yet another issue where there are some differences between cultures and within cultures and even over time, where the idea of an average family is a fairly fluid concept. So family structures can vary pretty wildly across different cultures, within cultures, changing over time. You see differences in how many children people have, how many people within that household are working. Do you have two parents in a household? Have those parents divorced? Are they educated? All sorts of different factors that can all change the dynamic of this average family. And despite all of this change and all of these things going on, people tend to have similar values for what they would call a successful marriage or a successful family. So things like having emotional closeness, where you feel close to and attached to the people in your family. Positive communication and problem solving is also another indicator of a successful marriage. If you and your spouse tend to agree on basic values and expectations, if you're both willing to accept and support each other and how you change over time, that all leads to you feeling that you have a successful relationship. And there are some interesting studies that have looked at marital satisfaction over time and looking at differences between the sexes and how people feel about things at different times. And again, there are so many studies that we could talk about. We'll keep it very, very brief here. But overall, Right after people get married, they experience sort of a very strong feeling of marital satisfaction, sort of that honeymoon stage where everything is perfect. And then we see a period of decline after that honeymoon phase, where there's a decline in marital satisfaction over the first few years. And there are a couple of factors that start to influence this feeling of satisfaction. Um, so the first of these is that the birth of children, which tend to come in a lot of marriages, starts to dramatically influence how the couples are interacting with each other and how they're spending their time. So after the first child is born, there tends to be a period of decreased marital satisfaction because the couples aren't just interacting with each other, there's a new dynamic now. And interestingly, after the children leave home, so as they get older and they move out and do their own thing, marital satisfaction starts to increase again, possibly because the parents are allowed to go back to just themselves and their spouse. But don't take this as an entirely negative experience where people start feeling less satisfied with their lives after they've become married. Married people seem to experience greater subjective well being than married adults overall. We're just looking at trends of how satisfied they feel at a particular point in their lives. So, again, a little bit more complicated than just the surface. And of course, you can't talk about becoming an adult without talking about what you're going to do with your adult life, which one of the big points outside of establishing a family is to establish a career. And so there are 5 stages that many psychologists can agree on for establishing a career. Starting at the beginning, you have a growth stage where you start formation of your initial interests. I'm in trouble with words today. So you start forming interests, decide what you do and don't like. What kind of work would you consider doing for the rest of your life? Next stage is when you start exploring. So the exploration stage is you start having some tentative ideas about what kind of a career you would like, and you start seeking out the education or training that you would need to pursue that career. Then you enter into your establishment phase, where people start to make their mark. They're going to probably come into some early instability. It's hard to get a job right off the bat, and people tend to hop around for a while before they become settled. You might also see people start changing careers at this stage because they figured out that they didn't actually like the career that they thought they would. And then they overcome that little bit of turbulence and end up in the maintenance stage, where you have a more stable career and you maintain what you're doing, not a lot of changes. And then as you get to the end of your career, you get into the decline stage. So your investment in work starts to decrease because, well, you're getting closer to retirement. You start becoming disillusioned with the whole system, and maybe you feel sad that you've wasted a lot of time in a career that you maybe don't love. There's lots of different factors that go into this, but over time, people start to become less invested in their work lives and want to focus on themselves again. And it's important to note here that though these stages seem to flow fairly smoothly between each other, there are a lot of disruptions that can be encountered as you go through these stages, especially for women. Women tend to get bumped off of this path for a variety of reasons, usually related to things like family responsibility that tend to fall mainly on women. So women tend to be caregivers. So if they choose to have children, their careers get put on hold. Or they might choose to no longer have a career. They might choose to be a stay-at-home mother. And even later in life, they might take on the role of caregiver and take care of their parents or their spouse's parents. So there are a lot of things that can disrupt this pathway, and a lot of those disruptions affect women a lot more than men. Again, so much more we could get into here, but we're going to keep it brief. And the textbook takes a moment to detour and talk about a midlife crisis. The idea that people hit a certain age and they panic about their lives. The talk of middle-aged men going out and buying sports cars to try and deal with their crisis of self. Though most research seems to show that this isn't necessarily the case. There was one study that found a lot of turbulence in people in their 40s to 50s, where they start focusing on their mortality and the reality of achieving their goals. But most people show pretty consistent happiness and general satisfaction with their lives, and it tends not to have a marked decline anywhere throughout adulthood. It tends to be pretty consistent. So this idea of everyone having a full-blown midlife crisis is more of a myth than a fact. And all of this is going to bring us to the end of life. So as people move into retirement and the golden years, and then we'll start talking about death and dying to wrap up. So a lot of people face retirement in a lot of different ways. And there are a lot of different factors that can influence how we view retirement. So some of these factors would be, is your spouse retired? If you have a good relationship with your spouse, you might be looking forward to retiring with them and both of you not having to work and being able to spend more time together and interact more and return to that state of just the two of you. However, if your spouse is still working, you might be reluctant to retire yourself because then you're going to be alone. And of course, this can be complicated if maybe you don't like your spouse as much and maybe you don't want to spend a lot of time with them. So lots of factors to consider there. Another big one is whether retirement is voluntary or not. Some people are forced to retire. They hit a certain age, the company lays them off. A lot of people don't like involuntary retirement, especially if they have really strong work ethic. If they are people who highly value their ability to do work and to be in their field, they might feel lost and depressed if they lose that ability to work. They feel like they've lost a part of their identity. So voluntary retirement seems to have more positive outcomes. And if people are not looking forward to retirement, if it's not something they're going to enjoy, they can become depressed or anxious or dissatisfied with their lives, which can be troublesome. And then at the very end here, we're going to wrap up with talking about death and dying. And this is another big field for psychology where you can talk about how people face their own mortality. And we approach death in a lot of different ways. And how we view death and how we choose to face death can be affected by our personal beliefs, by our customs, by our culture. And for the most part, people tend to be more accepting of their own death as they get older. So they can sort of contemplate their own mortality, but it gets difficult to think about others around them dying as well. And we can, of course, talk about the 5 stages of grief and dying, where people consider, or when people experience things like denial. They can't believe that this is happening to them. There's no way that they are going to die. Turns into anger, where they're angry at the situation, that they shouldn't have to go through this. They enter into bargaining, the idea that there must be something that they can do that would stave this off. And then they come into depression, where they kind of realize that it's happening and they're not okay with it. So they feel sad and depressed. And eventually they'll move into the stage of acceptance, where they come to terms with the fact that this is going to happen and death is coming. Which is a really, really dark note to end on, but that is, in fact, the end of the chapter.